Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the first event of the spring 2025 semester here at the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. It is the spring semester, even though it feels like we're still very much in the middle of winter outside as far as our temperature this evening. I'm Steve Knoll, Director of the Young Center, and delighted to welcome each of you here to our event this evening, both those who are here in the Booker Meeting House and those who are joining us online via the streaming service provided by our IT services. Each year, the Young Center is privileged to host a visiting scholar who is engaged in research or writing or both on subjects that advance our understanding of the life, culture, and beliefs of communities stemming from Anabaptist and Pietist roots. Last fall, the center's doctoral fellow was Naomi Kraenbring, who is working on a dissertation, which we will be hearing more about this evening, in which she is exploring how Brethren identity and theology shape the work of welcoming and resettling refugees in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and reciprocally, the influence that welcoming has on Brethren identity. Tonight, she'll share some themes, interpretation, analysis, and preliminary conclusions from her work. Sometimes Young Center visiting scholars come from around the world, and in this case, Naomi came from just across campus, which is great. She is on the pastoral team at Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren, and also teaches religious studies and peace studies courses here as an adjunct faculty member at Elizabethtown College. She is a graduate of Elizabethtown and of Bethany Theological Seminary, and is pursuing her PhD from the Carter School of Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you all being here. It is such a delight to see quite a few familiar faces. I appreciate your support and very appreciative of Elizabethtown College and the Young Center's offer to serve as a fellow this fall, because without that, I would not have made the progress that I've made on this project. You heard a little bit about some of the work I do as pastor of Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren, part-time adjunct faculty member here on campus, and working on my PhD. Which I jokingly say I'm doing on the side. And anyone who has worked on an academic program, but particularly a doctoral dissertation, knows that it doesn't happen on the side. I jokingly said to my dissertation chair in an email a couple of days ago that 5 a.m. has become my very good friend, because that's kind of the quiet time that I can carve out. Mornings are my best focus. So I will share with you where I'm at, and I'm happy for dialogue. And I consider this to sort of be hopefully another working step in my project. And I'd be really anxious and excited to hear your questions or thoughts or suggestions when we get to the end of the presentation. I do want to just give some acknowledgement to a few people. Special thanks to Dr. Karina Krostelina, who is my dissertation chair at George Mason, Dr. Mark Gopin, and Dr. Al Fuertes, who are on my committee. And also special thanks to Christina Booker, David Leiter, and John David Bowman, who have been part of my ad hoc dissertation committee as members of the Elizabethtown congregation and scholars in their own right, who have given their time and encouragement to helping me move forward with this project, and as well as all of you who are here from connecting with the congregation, connecting with the project, connecting with my family. Appreciate your support and from my family anyway, not allowing me to stop as I keep plugging away at this. So let me say that when I started this work, I was a full-time presidential scholarship recipient, full-time student at George Mason. And when I took the role on as pastor of Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren, that significantly affected the amount of time I had to work on the project. So I thought I would be done by now. I am not done by now, and that's okay. I also just want to acknowledge the present moment that we find ourselves in. It feels, I said to Steve earlier as I got here, it feels like sort of What I'm going to share is a little silly, given the urgency and weightiness of the issue of refugee resettlement and integration, and what is happening in our community as we speak. So I just want to acknowledge that and just also acknowledge that as I wear hats, both academically and in a pastoral capacity, I see the issue from a variety of angles. So some of what I will share this evening is different than what I would share in my pastoral context, but they certainly influence each other. So my working title currently for this project is, and this actually has been a working title I've used for several projects relating to this content as I've worked on research in a couple different capacities. Welcome to America's Refugee Capital, an exploration of the role of Brethren identity in refugee integration in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I plan to share with you this evening a bit about my assessment of the current problem I seek to address, which, as you are no doubt aware, has become even more challenging in the last few weeks. I'll give you some insight into my theoretical framework, the methodology that I'm using. I'm a bit of a methodology nerd, so I'll talk about that a little bit. I'll try not to go too crazy. And then I will share some of the early initial observations I have gathered from the first part of my data analysis, which is still in progress, and some thoughts I have as I kind of look at the scope of the data that I've gathered. And just to say that this is a qualitative project, so the data that I'm referring to is in the form of interviews. I'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to the methodology. If you are interested in hearing more about this project when it is complete, which I hope will be by the end of 2025, you are welcome to attend my dissertation defense, which I anticipate will have a Zoom option. And I have a hunch that we might have a little sharing at the church as well. So if you're interested in that, and you would not get our church information regularly from eTown COB, feel free to share your email with me, and I'd be happy to include you in updates as I move through the project. So this is Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. You'll notice as I move through the slides that this is a background that I use on all the slides. And I've been using this for all of the various presentations that I've done. Many of us, most of us in the room and probably online as well, are familiar with this geographic area. So this is not going to look unusual to most of us. And this is the focus context for this project. In January of 2017, a little over 8 years ago, in the wake of the first Trump inauguration, Franz Strasser from the BBC dubbed Lancaster as America's refugee capital due to its high per capita rate of refugee resettlement, the highest during the 2013 to 2016 period compared across resettlement areas in the entire United States. Lancaster has been proud of this title and continues to use it to reinforce its positive reputation for refugee resettlement activity. And that has caught my attention. I've been intrigued by Lancaster County's strong, politically conservative stance, but also strong, nonpartisan support for refugee resettlement activity. And this is after now, as we sit here in 2025, significant cuts to that program during the first Trump presidency. And as we have seen, again, significant, perhaps more significant cuts to that program in the past 3 weeks. As I've spent some time in another research project digging into local news articles about refugee resettlement activity in Lancaster County, I have noticed that the Anabaptist heritage of Lancaster County is often invoked both as reasoning for the roots of this welcome posture by this place, as well as the primary reason why this welcome activity continues to happen. This study seeks to use hermeneutic phenomenological methods, which I'll talk more about in a minute, to investigate the lived experiences of Lancaster County residents and explore the role that Anabaptist religious identity plays in attitudes towards and behaviors supporting refugee welcome and integration. And I'm focusing narrowly through the lens of persons connected with the Church of the Brethren. In the beginnings of my research in the spring of 21, there were 82 million.4 displaced people in the world. So the next 3 points I'm going to share are going to have this grayed out, which was 2021, the black crossed out, which was a year ago when I shared some of this information during my proposal defense for my project. And then the standalone number that's not crossed out is current, or as current as we have, which is data from June of last year, released in October by UNHCR. So the reality is these numbers are probably larger than you see. And I just think it's interesting to see the progression just since I've started my work. The number of displaced persons in the world is up from, in 2000, 25 years ago, the number then was 35 million. So that's the increase over 25 years. Displaced people is a total population of persons who are in some category of displacement. That includes internally displaced people, which are persons who have been forcibly shifted out of their home, but are still within the boundaries of their country. And so you can see the progression of the numbers. This is a segment of that larger number. And of that larger number, then you can see the numbers of refugees. And that is up from approximately 12 to 14 million in the year 2000 refugees. And that was actually a low point in 2000. It was down from the preceding years in the late 90s. And then it has only increased since then. As you are also likely aware, Church World Service, which is the primary resettlement agency in our locale, has been dramatically affected with massive furloughs to reduce their workforce after funding cuts and executive orders that brought refugee resettlement to a halt in January. I attended CWS's virtual town hall webinar 2 weeks ago to hear the update on what was happening. And I attended in my role as a clergy person. And I don't remember many of the numbers, but one area that has been massively impacted is legal support, which is, of course, what provides pathways to citizenship for immigrants, our immigrant neighbors and friends. And if I'm remembering correctly, there were 17 people in the Lancaster CWS office working in legal support, and there are now 2, just as one example. The other category of persons that would complete this composite of displaced people is asylum seekers or other people in need of international protection. That number also has grown. I didn't include the previous numbers on that. And for a definition, because refugee can mean more than one thing, but according to UNHCR, a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular group. Most likely, they cannot return home or are afraid to do so. War and ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are the leading causes of refugees fleeing their countries. And 73% of all refugees and other people in need of international protection come from just 5 countries: Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, and Sudan. So as I became intrigued by this situation over the last few years, there have been a few things that I've noticed. One, and this I've have some evidence of this from other research I've done, is that refugee welcome appears to generate nonpartisan agreement in Lancaster County. Persons on all sides of the political spectrum and theological spectrum tend to lean into supporting refugee resettlement. Lancaster County has land, wealth, organizational resources, and passionate people. And so one of the questions is, in what ways could refugee welcome support and activity be increased or shifted? And I'll come back to that a little bit more at the end in one of my final questions. Could unity around refugee welcome and integration help transform polarized partisan conflict? And this was kind of the seed question that has motivated most of my research. And there's actually been some writing by others on this as well, this concept of refugee resettlement as potentially a unifying, depolarizing force. And so ultimately, my question as I step into this project is, how does religious identity and also Lancaster County identity contribute or play a role in refugee welcome and integration in this space? Does it help or hinder or neither? And so my research question that I'm focusing on, how does religious identity influence perspectives on refugees and support for refugee welcome, resettlement, and integration in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania? So I'm going to share a little bit about some of the theoretical framework and concepts that I'm kind of bringing together and which I've done most of my literature review on as I approach this project. One is literature relating to refugee welcome, resettlement, and integration, and that is both US-based and primarily European-based literature. Literature on religious identity, including social identity. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The concept of hermeneutics, which would be defined as the art of interpretation. And I find this to be particularly fascinating concept. And this is a really important piece of why I chose the methodology I chose, which is phenomenology. Phenomenology being the study of a particular phenomenon. So in the area of refugee resettlement and integration, the research thus far indicates that host community perspectives tend to be negative. That does not mean that all host community perspectives are negative, but the research that has been done has primarily been on communities where the attitudes have been more negative. And again, this is primarily in a European context. There's been a lot more research in Europe over the last 15 years or so, given the Syrian crisis. More research is based in Europe. See, if I could remember what my points are, then I would not say it out of order. Political and social issues affect attitudes about refugee integration. So refugee integration is often influenced by economic factors, population factors. I could cite a couple of different towns in the United States, Lancaster not being one of them, where refugee resettlement has been viewed as a way to keep a town existing because the population has shifted somewhere else, gentrification or other reasons. So there are political and social issues, obviously, as we are aware, that affect attitudes. Faith groups play a prominent role in refugee resettlement. Out of the 10 resettlement agencies in the United States, 7 of them are faith-based. Church World Service, Episcopal Migration Ministries, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, LIRS, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, World Relief Corporation, and Bethany Christian Services. A couple of those, 2 or 3 of those have had connections in this area as well. And so I've identified a couple of gaps in the research that I'm seeking to fill, one of which is there has just not been as much research on US-based refugee studies, on US-based, particularly host communities in the United States, and particularly host communities that are fostering or demonstrating positive affect towards refugees and sympathetic attitudes. From a social identity perspective, and I'm going to move through this because I want to make sure we have time for some of the other stuff. There's a lot here. Individual and group identity are interrelated. So thinking about how we think of ourselves as individuals and then also the groups that we identify with, those are not standalone things. There are a lot of interrelations between them. And the purpose of identity is the function that it serves is to help improve our self-concept, help us to feel like we belong, help us to feel like we know who we are. And the individual and group identity can vary in salience, can vary in strength. For some, sometimes we lean more into our individual identity. Sometimes we lean more into a group identity. And there are various results of how we find ourselves, where we find our identity strongest. A couple of different theories. I'm not going to go through all the details on this, but social identity theory, Henry Tajfel in the late 1970s was is one of the seminal authors in social identity. And then Turner worked with Tajfel and kind of evolved into his own self-categorization theory. And this is where we start seeing group memberships as being an important part of identity. Who do I feel like I'm connected to? And how does that help me understand better who I am or feel good about myself? That also then creates boundaries, right? When we're part of a group, when we identify strongly with a group, particularly the stronger that we identify with a group, the stronger the boundaries are between us and them. And so that can create conflict. That can also create individual strengths. So there's certainly pros and cons. Further research has increased in its understanding of the fluidity and the dynamic change of identity. And there are pros and cons of these kind of prominent theories. Some of the downsides is that they tend to exclude the moral and ethical element. They're focused more on how we understand ourselves and not so much how other people understand us or how I would identify, how I would categorize others. And again, pros and cons there. And these methods or these theories tend to be pretty compartmentalized and structured. Looking at religious identity, which is my focus, my subset within social identity, there's a difference between religious identity and religiosity, although they tend to be sometimes understood interchangeably. But religious identity tends to be how we identify ourselves with a religious group or a religious belief system or a wisdom tradition, whereas religiosity is the behaviors, the practices that we engage in. And religiosity tends to be measured by belief, behavior, and belonging. There's been a lot of writing on those characteristics. And so here would be the definition I would give for religious identity: an affinity for or affiliation with a particular religious, faith-based, or wisdom tradition, stance, or community that is characterized by a particular belief system, moral structure, set of ethics, cosmological story, rituals or practices, or other activities that create meaning and help clarify purpose. Religious identity and religiosity can contribute to both conflict if there is competition between in-group and out-group us and them values. It can also contribute to pro-social behavior. What are the good things that those religious traditions or faith wisdom traditions are generating? And the hermeneutic approach, thinking of this from an interpretation lens, allows to increase the flexibility instead, as opposed to having them these concepts being siloed or bounded. So now we get a little bit more into where I'm going methodologically with the phenomenology and the hermeneutics. Understanding that knowledge is created through experiencing the world, and that concept of experience is really critical to the work that I'm doing. Husserl was one of the seminal kind of philosophers thinking about this concept of hermeneutics and understanding that we understand the world through our lived experience. And he would say that we can find out about other people's lived experience by just putting everything else aside, and we can get to the pure experience that someone had or that I had. Heidegger then suggests, but we all have biases that we carry with us. And the reality is we can try to move past those, but can we really? And so he would have suggested that we can't really access the pure experience, but we can get something out of it. And he creates this sort of structure of a technique called bracketing, where you try to set aside the bias, which does not have a moral value. Bias is not necessarily bad. In order to get to the experience. And then we've got Hans-Georg Gadamer, which I find also to be really a compelling piece, where he's talking about the fusions of the horizon of interpretation. So what we know or what we remember are our experiences, our understanding of what happened in the past and what's happening right now somehow come together to create the present moment. What you see and what I see actually together form a reality. And so that kind of fusion of different, and that expands the interpretation, that expands the possible reality. And then some additional authors took that concept because Gadamer was really working with interpreting text, and they start talking about that maybe the person can be interpreted. So then the shift happens from a text to a person. And that's where we get into the phenomenological understanding of the people that I interviewed. That's now my text. That's who I'm studying. I'm also working, because I'm focusing on Lancaster County, working on space and place, and understanding that hermeneutics is embedded in space and place. And this is probably one of the most powerful books that I've read in the last few years, Yu-Fu Tuan's Space and Place from 1977. If you're not familiar with him as an author, really, really good stuff. If you like thinking about this kind of stuff like I do, and maybe you don't, and that's okay. I would highly recommend his work. He talks a lot about the essentiality of experience in forming an understanding of place, moving beyond space to a place that has meaning, and that the experiences that we engage in is what creates that meaning. So thus, phenomenology is the methodology that I need to use because I want to dig into experiences that people have had with refugee resettlement in Lancaster County. That's my phenomenon. And I've already mentioned that the early settlement of Anabaptist in Lancaster County is often referenced in contemporary conversations about welcoming refugees in this place, Lancaster County. You are probably well familiar with some of these distinctive values of Anabaptists, which also then translate into Church of the Brethren: community, peace and nonviolence, obedience to Jesus' teachings, set-apart group or sectarian group, mutuality, believers' baptism, lived faith. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the things that are in my mind as I enter this text. And so my methodology is interpretive phenomenological analysis. I'm going to just kind of quickly go through some of this. The big things to be aware of is I did semi-structured interviews. That was primarily what I did in the early part of the fall. Semi-structured meaning I had kind of a list of questions. I have a couple examples on a couple of slides from now, but it was mostly a dialogue, and I was doing more listening than speaking. It wasn't like please tell me your birthday. Please tell me this. It's open-ended questions. Tell me stories about this. Based on lived experience. And there's this triple hermeneutics. There's this 3-level interpretation. I'm assuming that the person who I'm interviewing is interpreting their experience. Then I'm interpreting what I hear with the knowledge that the reader then is going to interpret what I write. So it's kind of this building. And that's important because not all phenomenology uses that assumption of hermeneutics. Some phenomenology that's trying to get to the pure experience does not allow for any interpretation at all. My position is I don't think it's possible to not have that happen. Very much attention to individual unique experiences, looking for the perspective of the participants, and the phenomena of interest, as I mentioned, the posture and activity of welcoming, hosting, resettling, and integrating refugees in Lancaster County. And I'm using 3 populations. I have 5 participants in each. I have interviewed persons who are lifelong Church of the Brethren participants. I've interviewed persons who have come to connect with the Church of the Brethren at some point later. And I've interviewed persons who have been resettled in this area by Lancaster County Church of the Brethren connected groups. So I'm kind of trying to get this from a couple of different angles. Lancaster County residents who are connected. I'm sampling from people that I know of or people that people told me of. And those are kind of some of the guidelines I'm looking for. Here are the couple of the example questions I mentioned. Tell me your story of coming to live in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Tell me about your experience with or relationship to a Church of the Brethren congregation, the Brethren heritage or Brethren beliefs. Tell me about an experience you've had with refugee welcome and resettlement in Lancaster County. And there were more than that, but those are some examples. And as I'm working through it, I am doing a kind of an iterative process of examining one interview. I turned it from audio into English on the page, reading it over and over again, taking notes while hanging in it, and then taking those notes and making kind of starting to put together analytical statements about what I'm finding that's arising from each interview. And then I will take, and what I'm in the process of doing right now with group 1 is taking each of those 5 interviews and seeing what arises from each of those 5 that has some commonality. Are there concepts that are arising in repeated places? And that's the short version of what is on these slides. So I'm going to keep going. So here are some of the things I've picked up so far from group 1. And I just want to highlight group 1 is the individuals who have been lifelong Church of the Brethren connected persons. So one of the things that I think that I'm seeing thus far is how people feel about refugees and the work of refugee resettlement is important. And some of the language that has been used is language like this refugee resettlement is so rewarding. I can tell by the words people are using, and there have at least 3 interviews that I can think of off the top of my head. People were led to tears thinking about the work that they've been involved in or the work that they've observed. So the compassion, the empathy is present, and that is how people feel about it is really important. And I think I'm going to need to spend some more time there. And there's a connection between, I was going to say correlation, but the connection between how people feel and then a motivation to engage in faithful action. And I have a couple of examples from some of the interviews. So this is from one interview. I think that living in an area that welcomes and resettles refugees is just a wonderful thing. And I mean, this whole thing of refugees and immigrants, I mean, I think the Lord wants us to bring people in. He didn't turn anybody away. Why should we? And even though they aren't necessarily documented, people have to be given a chance, and they're leaving places that are horrible. Governments and famine and just wars. I feel very confident that it wasn't just wars, just interrupt wars. I'm also noticing that the connection with place, with Lancaster County, because I probed into that, is important for some, but not for everyone. But the role of family seems really key. And I think that's interesting given the familial language that we use a lot of in Anabaptist circles and certainly in the Church of the Brethren. That familial language is there. And I think that that may be the key to the connection with place. And so here was an example from another interview. And so what I love about being here, referring to Lancaster County, is it feels like home. I'm into genealogy, and so my roots are here. And it's just fun exploring places and knowing like that my people's blood and bones are here. So a real connection to the land, the space, but not by nature of it being Lancaster County, but by nature of the family. And that concept came up in more than one place. I'm just sharing a few examples. And this is also something that I'm still working through, but I'm observing that religious identity affects and also is affected by refugee welcome, resettlement, and integration peace-building work. I think it's just the way I see the world, and that I think we are created for relationship, relationship with God, but relationship with his people that he created. And I never, ever in my wildest dreams would have thought I'd ever meet anybody from Afghanistan and Muslims. And so just to treat other people at, the Imago Dei, that there is, such importance in each life, and that, if I can be a part of that. So that's kind of from that first group that I'm still working through with my analysis. But I spent some extra time, even though I'm trying really hard not to, because I'm not on group 2 and 3 yet with my data analysis. I didn't want to dig too far into that because that kind of messes up my methodology a bit. But I went back and kind of surveyed some of those and have some other, and I'm not going to use the word conclusions. I'm hesitant to use the word conclusions until I've worked all the way through the data analysis. So I'm using the language of observations. So some other observations that go broader than just that first group. And one is that Anabaptist and Pietist ideas arise in interview data. And I was looking back through one of the things I mentioned that I didn't talk much about when it came up on the slide. I have a researcher's journal, and that's part of what I'm doing to try to prevent my bias or my desire to see certain things come out. So I was actually I saw one of the entries that I had written about this, that this is something I thought I'd see, but I want to make sure that I'm seeing it because it's there, not because I'm inputting it on the interviews. But some of the themes or some of the topics that have been touched on include peace building and nonviolence. And this is so the code is the first number 3.3. 3 means it's group 3, and group 3 is former refugees who have been resettled by a Church of the Brethren congregation or welcome team. So this is from a former refugee. One thing I really, really love is we believe in peace, no war. That is a really big part of my life that I really believe in. And this is from someone who's been a lifelong Church of the Brethren person. I think it's incredibly important work. I feel like as a country, we've done a lot of things over the years in other countries that have been detrimental, and we've had a hand in causing people to become refugees because of our involvement in wars and things like that. So I think we have a responsibility to help as well because of things that, as an American, I feel like I'm culpable, in a way for the footprint, if you want to say that we've left behind in a lot of different places in the world. Also, the concept of community. I feel more connected with the church people. This is also from a former refugee. When I went to high school, I don't feel that welcoming, but in the church, I feel like a lot of welcoming. I think our denomination does relationships very well, and I guess you could frame it in terms of community, family, and, coming from our faith that everyone, we're the priesthood of all believers, that we are all important. No one is higher than another, that kind of emphasis on relationship. I will say that there was at least one interview from one of the categories that did not find this familial piece to be a part of their personal experience. And when I analyze that transcript, I'm going to have to work with that. What does that individual case say, and how does that inform the larger picture? So none of these are intended. These are intended to be taken very individually. None of these are the whole story. The concepts of service and humility, that was like my parents and grandparents' whole thing, was just like show God's love through what we do. I mean, they were never loud about it. They were just quietly served. And someone else, I would say, Church of the Brethren service by the manner of our living. And then the concept of obedience to Jesus and scripture. I'm an introvert by nature, but we don't speak their language, but I'm learning some words. And so it's, you just maneuver those moments of language issues, culture issues with just, my memory is she teared up at this point, like this is where I feel like I'm called to right now. So I think it's kind of, you can hear me like, sort of passionate about it, that this is where I think I should be. So I need to keep my hands open and say, okay, what next, And then leaning more into the pietist piece, this kind of personal connection with the divine. I'm a follower of Jesus. I don't know that I have to put Christian in there. I feel that I have a close relationship with him. And it's all about loving Jesus and being in love with him. And that's where it starts and stops, A lot of people say, a lot. I try to keep it it's important to me to keep it very true to exactly how it was said. And in fact, when I did the notes portion, that was really hard for me because I don't like to rephrase what was said. I like to really have it in the words of the interviewee. There were some things about characteristics of Lancaster County that were shared across several transcripts. Some positive things that were shared include the landscape, the beauty, the weather. A lot of people talked about all of those things. The diversity of people, food, languages, and this rural and urban connection that are pretty close to each other. Urban as one might call Lancaster City, but comparatively. And then there were some things that were couched as negative. I'm not saying these are negative. I'm not giving my opinion. I'm just saying that they were couched by the interviewees in terms of being negative. One was a strong Republican conservative presence was couched as negative. I mean, I love the people. I have to say that. But there are some things that are not problematic for me, but that we are not along the same pathway. Politics, for instance, a very conservative, very Republican area, and that's not me at all. Not me at all. I find there to be such an incongruity between many of the people with their religious base of the county and the political base of the county, and I don't get it. And also, this came up in previous research I've done, and it came up again in this one, and I wasn't probing for it either time, so I feel like this might be something to pursue in another project. But the difficulty to break in to belonging in Lancaster County. Lancaster County has very much its own environment, its own culture, and in that environment, there's very much a culture. If you're from Lancaster County, you're from Lancaster County. If you're not, you're a newbie, and it's hard to break into. And that gets in the microcosm even of the church. Well, who's your grandparents? Where did they go to church? Kind of thing. And if you don't give them the right answer, you might not fit in. And I would this person didn't say this, but I would almost add, if you don't have the last name that matches the tradition, is it difficult to fit in? Not a lot of Kraenbrings in the Church of the Brethren. Half of us are in the room. So as I kind of start pulling together some big thoughts, I titled this slide, So What? And Don Crable, this is because of you that I called this So What? So I met with Don and Steve very early in my dissertation process as I was thinking about topics. And one of the things that Don said was, it's really important to so what? What's the point? You can do research just for the sake of doing research. You can write a paper just to, spit out information, but why is it important? And that's hung with me. And in fact, that's been my greatest challenge to do this presentation, because I don't know that I know all the so what yet, because I'm not done with the project, and because the landscape is changing so rapidly right now that the so what the most important thing is today might be different than what it was a month ago or a month from now. So I'm doing my best. I'll share with you some of my thoughts. I think that and some of this too is influenced for good or for ill by my pastoral work. It remains to be seen how the Lancaster County area will respond in the wake of the most recent refugee cuts. However, I can share anecdotally that local congregations, including Anabaptist congregations, are invested in supporting CWS, as evidenced by really large attendance at CWS's recent town hall webinar with updates that I mentioned that I attended a couple weeks ago. Congregations and clergy that care for refugees in their midst are concerned that ICE will profile individuals to investigate based on appearance, detaining first, inducing trauma, and asking questions for clarification later. I'm not saying that's happened. I'm just saying that's a concern. Conversations and research need to continue as the concept of refugee is woven with immigrant in many ways. Further research could continue to investigate the roots of the differences in attitudes towards refugees and asylum seekers, for example. And there are differences. That hasn't been the focus of my research yet, but it has come out and occasionally that there are differences. This will not, I don't think, surprise you, in attitudes towards refugees as opposed to attitudes towards persons who do not have the acceptable documentation yet. And how does that play out? And how does that affect belonging in the community? And I think too, the role, because this has come up in multiple of the interviews I've done, the role of relationship, and this is not unique to the Church of the Brethren, but the role of relationship can never be overestimated. It is too simplistic to make broad statements about the Church of the Brethren or Anabaptists or Lancaster County in relation to support of refugee resettlement and integration. But what I'm doing in this project is with individual cases that can be examined to identify shared themes and draw conclusions that may apply more broadly. In one of the interviews that I did, the individual shared this quote from someone else, which I've seen attributed to a couple different people. But this really well describes this concept of hermeneutics as well, this interpretation. Where you sit determines what you see. The experiences that each of us individually have had affect how we understand and how we see. So a couple of the questions I have, kind of as I continue moving in this and continue with writing and analysis, what will be the role of persons of faith and faith groups outside of governmental policy, funding, and agencies? Because those paths right now have been closed. And so a question I have, based on what I see from a pastoral perspective, but also as I look at these persons that I've interviewed who have passion and affirmation of refugee resettlement in Lancaster County, what's next? And how will it look differently perhaps than it has looked in the past at least 4 years, and certainly historically long before that? Does something need to shift? Second, how might it be possible to maintain the nonpartisan ethos of refugee welcome, resettlement, and integration activity that has historically been present in Lancaster County? And third, in what ways can persons supporting refugee resettlement in Lancaster County help to rehumanize refugees and immigrants, providing hope for the future of resettlement and peace building? I don't know that something's going to change tomorrow, but I come from a place both academically and spiritually of hope. And so what does refugee resettlement look like when it's leaning into a place of hope? And I think the Church of the Brethren, certainly Christian traditions as a whole, many faith traditions lean into that place of hope. And how does that inform understandings of what needs to happen next with refugee resettlement? I think some of this will continue to come out in my discussion and analysis. Some of this is just stepping a little bit more into the present moment, and it's just difficult to separate sometimes. But these are some of the questions that I'm continuing to hang with. So that's what I have. It's still a work in progress. Very open to your questions or thoughts or comments. Yeah.
You know how many, the total number of refugees in Lancaster County and possibly in the state of Pennsylvania?
I could Google it. So the question was, do I know how many refugees there are in Lancaster County or in the state of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania? I do not know offhand. I did at some point. It would be, yeah, I've looked more at global numbers in that early data. Steve can Google it real quick. Or not. Yeah.
I sense that we were beginning around 2000. looking at it historically, there were a lot of refugees resettled here in the 70s and the 80s.
Right.
Our congregation, for instance, took in 76. There's a history to this.
Yes, absolutely. Ken's comment is what I've looked at is really primarily in the last 3 to 5 years, but some of the data I shared with you is from 2000, the last 25 years. But Ken is observing absolutely correctly that there was heavy resettlement in this area, even in the Elizabethtown congregation in the 70s, upwards of 70 some people. Yeah, for sure. So there's a history there.
From East Asia,
Yes.
Cambodia, Vietnam, and then later Middle America, Central America.
Primarily from South Asia and Central America. Yeah. And of course, part of that is what has allowed CWS to become have the strength as an agency in this area that it has. Yeah. Don?
What is the total number of people that you have interviewed?
15.
15.
5 in each of the 3 categories.
Say the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. The total number of people, thank you. The total number of people that I interviewed, 5 in each of the 3 categories for a total of 15.
Okay.
My reaction too was that this is a very recent study. This is not getting a good full picture of Lancaster County. And also, it seems to me a part of this interviewing should be people who came here as refugees, let's say, and they're currently about 70 years old. They can give you a real insight to how the refugee business began in Lancaster County and how we got to where we are and what caused these people who are now 70, 80 years of age who took on the responsibility of taking this project on.
Right. So Carol's comment is, let me see if I can recap it, questioning the scope of the study, that it really historically should go further. And some of that is more in my literature review, which I didn't necessarily share. And also the suggestion that maybe to include interviews with refugees who were resettled here much further ago at this, maybe earlier in the process of refugee resettlement in Lancaster County. One of the reasons that I've kept it more recent is as a phenomenological study, the further in distance we get from the experience, the harder it is to recall. So I've tried to keep it. Now, one of the persons that I interviewed who was a resettled refugee has been here since the 90s. So that was probably the longest ago resettled refugee that I interviewed. What's that? In my study, correct. Yeah. There would be, using a more historical method, there would absolutely be merit to doing a larger historical scope. And CWS has done some of that work at their anniversary years. There's publications that include some of that, but yeah, no, thank you. Mm-hmm.
You talked at the very beginning about identity and like how interacting with different people can shape your identity. And then as a denomination, identity could maybe like shift. And you also had a quote where people reference their grandparents and how that reflected like Anabaptist values. Anyway, have you seen anyone or heard anyone reference like a shift in what it means to be Church of the Brethren or Anabaptist? Like the quote you shared was that their grandparents or parents did service quietly. And is that different than how people are responding to refugees today?
I'm going to do a terrible job of recapping that briefly. That's okay. Lydia's question is about whether I observed persons who experienced a shift in their identity by nature of their refugee resettlement experience. Is that it in a nutshell? So my analysis so far, the deep analysis I've done has been with these lifelong brethren. I'm recalling a couple of comments, particularly in the category of persons who are not lifelong brethren, but have become brethren, that there may be some more shifting happened. I haven't gotten as deep into that analysis yet. And I didn't read all of those interviews today. Again, I kind of did a little bit of scanning, but that's a good question. That's part of what I'll be looking at now as I go back and do this analysis, and particularly in the discussion. So yeah. Nothing shocking is the answer to that question, though. I would love to be able to say there was this person and they helped with refugee resettlement and that made them, they had this faith movement. Then none of that did not come up in any of the interviews. It was more the other way around. People relying is not the right word, referencing their religious identity as the foundation for the refugee resettlement work. If there was any of the reciprocal, it was more in sort of personal characteristics. Working with refugees has helped me become more open, has helped me feel more helpful, know what others have experienced. So that's not necessarily a religious identity piece, but more of a personal characteristic.
As someone who has completed a PhD in qualitative research, you have my full sympathies.
Thank you. He's offering sympathies for as one who has also completed a PhD in qualitative methods.
I wanted to ask you about, have you any vision of optimality in this, where the quantity of the refugees overwhelms the goodness that is being brought to them? And I ask this question because this is the problem that Ireland is facing right now. When the government has taken charge of the refugee problem, created entities that promote refugee care, and has done some pretty lousy jobs dumping refugees in small towns that are already deprived themselves. So something to chew on.
Yeah.
If you have recommendations for that, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, goodness. If I can solve Ireland's problem. The question was about, there we go. The question was about whether I've come across writing or whether anything has come through relating to the quantity of refugees overwhelming the positive goodness of the people who are willing to host. That's a fantastic question. It's interesting. So this is kind of aside from interviews. This isn't something that necessarily came out in my interviews, but I mentioned earlier that there have been some locations who have utilized refugee resettlement as a way to keep their towns alive. But the opposite can be the case too, which I think is what you're alluding to, where the reality is, even as we have resettled refugees in Elizabethtown, our proximity to Lancaster is such that it becomes challenging to get to jobs, to find housing, and you have to be able to drive, or we don't have mass transit in this country, certainly not in this location that's super helpful. So there are challenges, and I wonder if smaller locales become overwhelmed more quickly because there's not the resources available. That's a good question, a good thought to chew on. Yeah, I have to go back and look at some of the other and see what's new in the literature. I need to investigate again. Yeah.
Earlier in the slides, you mentioned the hope that the refugee issue will bring people together. Do you have any thoughts on how that hope will be realized given what the situation is today, with refugees actually being the lightning rod of division?
Yeah. And I feel like that's shifted since the first administration. A little bit. I think you probably didn't catch, but I kind of paused because I almost said after I read that bullet point that I'm not sure my hope is as strong as it was when I first started working on this project. But I'm not sure that's the right way to say it. I think that the realities have changed. With it being a lightning rod issue, I didn't repeat the question. Sorry, I'm just realizing. The question was, do I still have whatever that I don't remember which slide it was on now, talking about the hope of refugee resettlement as potentially a unifying force. And there was a woman named Jennifer Foy. She, I don't believe is any longer, but she had been with World, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the agency, World Relief. And she had written on some of that. And I had kind of been thinking it. And when I saw someone else writing it, I was like, oh, Maybe two heads are better than one. Maybe this is a possibility. It does feel different in this moment. I continue to use that personally as a motivator for continuing this research because I think it could be possible. I don't know if the reality is still the same as it was, 5 years ago.
And the kernel of that hope very well be in what we found with brethren
Right.
theology.
Yeah. Yeah.
And practice.
Yeah. And as I kind of suggested a couple of times in my slides, it may be that the locus of refugee resettlement needs to shift. I don't know what that looks like, but it is hoped to be found perhaps through a different means.
It's calling Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the America's refugee capital, influence either positively or negatively the actual what actually needs to be done in terms of refugee integration.
The question was, does calling Lancaster County America's refugee capital influence positively or negatively what needs to happen to keep refugee resettlement going? Is that? Yeah.
Calling refugee resettlement, how does it affect refugee resettlement, refugee integration?
Yeah, I don't know. I was a little surprised. One of the things I started doing that wasn't on my list of questions initially, but I started asking my interviewees, were they familiar with that phrase? And I actually was surprised how many had not heard that. And I think it's just because I'm so steeped in it that I just assumed everyone had heard that language. And I see it in the newspapers a lot. But more people were not familiar with that language than were. What I think it has done is it has created, so thinking back to this question about identity, I think it has created an aspect of identity for Lancaster County as America's refugee capital. And so then the question is, do we, writ large, Lancaster County, continue to strive to live up to that identity, or do we change our identity? And until such time that the population no longer feels affinity with that tag, there's, what happens to keep that live, or does it need to change? But there's a fair amount, at least in kind of news reports and stuff that I've looked at in a different project, a fair amount of, I use the word pride, recognition, affirmation of that piece of identity. And when there's something that we have as a part of our identity, we want to kind of if that's giving us self-concept, which is the case, can also be the case with a place. We want to figure out how to keep that, because if that feels right, if that feels good, the question is, will it actively continue to happen, or will it shift? Don't know.
You, a percentage of the population are reading newspapers.
True. Yep. Yeah. And in fact, all of the newspaper research I did online, not with a physical paper. Yeah. Yeah. Fewer people are reading the newspapers was Ken's comment. So then the question is, are people familiar with that language if they're not reading that media? Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Having to do, this may be a little bit far afield, but you're probably aware of the lawsuit that a number of churches are, made against ICE or against the government in terms of, what should we say, keeping ICE out of the sanctuaries, because that might influence the religious. I'd just like to hear you say some things, how that, maybe not even how it affects but just your perspective on all of that.
Yeah. So the question was about the lawsuit that has been, or the complaint that has been put forward by the Quakers, and now a whole number of other religious denominations have joined, including the Church of the Brethren, which is just so one aspect. And the question is, I guess, what do I think about that? The thing that I first thought about it is how fascinating that, given Anabaptists' tendency to not be involved in legal and political means, I thought it was has the Mennonite Church become involved in that lawsuit? I thought it was really fascinating that happened as quickly as it did. It will be interesting to see what comes of it. I haven't read the complaint in its entirety, but it is primarily relating to congregations churches no longer being deemed safe spaces, set apart spaces of sanctuary for persons that need physical and immigration shelter. Yeah, I'm not sure. There's a lot there. I put on my pastor hat when I respond to that, and I'm not sure that it's all related, but I'm not sure that I have much of an answer from an academic perspective. From a pastoral perspective, in our congregation, we've sort of said we will do what we need to do to serve as the hands and feet of Jesus with the building that we've been provided. I mean, that hasn't become an issue. Don't necessarily predict that it will. But I think it's interesting to see these religious groups pushing back. It kind of leans back into the historic Peace Church affinity of the Quakers and the Mennonites and the Brethren, although of course there's many other groups that are now participating in this too. So yeah, I don't have a really good answer, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The idea of the sanctity of the sanctuary goes back centuries.
Absolutely.
Centuries. If the fugitive could beat the sheriff to the church door, presumably had sanctuary.
The idea of the sanctity of the sanctuary goes back a very, very long time.
It's biblical.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Naomi, for sharing, and thanks for all of you who asked questions and continued the conversation. Before we dismiss for this evening, I'd like to remind you all of a couple upcoming events, including an event next Wednesday, February 26th at 7 p.m., not here, but across campus in High Library, and in the writer's alcove of the library, to be specific, on the main floor of the library. Next Wednesday, E-Town students Kaylin Tendo and Jordan Dutko will be sharing from their work, researching and recovering the history of students and faculty of color at Elizabethtown College. This is fascinating work that I was able to hear their run through the other day as they're practicing it. And it's fascinating work that is very much part of the college's 125th anniversary this year. It has a companion display that is actually on view right now. You don't have to wait till next Wednesday to see the exhibit. The exhibit that accompanies their research is in the library's Idea Lab and is available for you to view now and through the end of March, I believe. But their presentation is next Wednesday at 7 p.m. in the library. I'll also mention our upcoming Young Center banquet and Dernball lecture and seminar about a month from now, March 20 and 21. The focus of the Dernball lecture and seminar this year is the Bible as a source of renewal and the Bible as a source of conflict in Anabaptism and Pietism. The lecture and seminar are being led by historian John D. Roth, who, in addition to being a historian of Anabaptism and Pietism, he is also the general editor of the newly published Anabaptist Community Bible, a project which I believe Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren contributed Bible study notes to that new Anabaptist Community Bible. So he will be. John Roth, will be presenting the Dernball lecture and seminar this year, March 20 and 21. And information about the Dernball seminar and lecture and registering for the banquet, more information in our newsletter, which you can pick up paper copies or view on the Young Center website. And there's information there about registering for these events, as well as other events that are coming up in April. So special thanks this evening to our support staff from Information Technology Services who made the live streaming possible. Thanks to Elizabethtown College for its support of the Young Center. Safe travels as you go from here and return to your homes. Thanks for coming.